My parents thought they were solving two problems at once when they announced my pregnant sister would be taking over my apartment. What they didn't know was that I'd been hiding an eviction notice for 2 weeks, desperately searching for a new place while watching my family plan to hand over something that was already slipping through my fingers. The irony was almost laughable, except nothing about what happened next was funny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chen, and at 24, I thought I had my life figured out in that naive way that recent college graduates do. I'd just finished my marketing degree at the University of Colorado, Denver, and unlike most of my classmates who were still living in cramped dorm rooms or their childhood bedrooms, I had my own place. A real apartment with 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and windows that caught the morning light just right when I drank my coffee before work. The apartment was in Riverside Heights, a neighborhood that had been quietly transforming over the past few years. When I first moved in during my junior year of college, it was still affordable for students and young professionals. Tree-lined streets with a mix of older apartment buildings and small houses, close enough to downtown Denver for my internships, but far enough away that I could actually afford the rent. My parents, Bob and Susan Chen, had been skeptical when I announced I was moving out of the dorms, but I'd convinced them by showing them my budget spreadsheet and my part-time job at Tony's Pizza Palace. Working at Tony's wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than most student jobs, especially with the tips from the dinner rush. I'd spent 2.5 years perfecting the art of balancing hot pizza boxes while navigating crowded dining rooms, memorizing orders for large families, and keeping a smile plastered on my face even when customers were rude or demanding. The owners, Tony and Maria Rossetti, treated their employees like family, and Tony would often slip extra shifts my way when he knew I was saving up for something important, like textbooks or apartment deposits. My parents had always been proud of my work ethic, though they worried I was taking on too much. Dad would call every Sunday evening, his voice carrying that mix of concern and admiration that I'd grown used to over the years. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Lakewood, methodical and steady in everything he did, while Mom managed the front office of a dental practice and had perfected the art of making everyone feel welcome the moment they walked through the door. They'd built a comfortable life in their suburban home, complete with a meticulously maintained garden that was Mom's pride and joy, and a garage workshop where Dad restored vintage furniture in his spare time. My younger sister Chloe was a different story entirely. 4 years younger than me, she'd always been the family's wild card. Where I was careful and planned everything in advance, Chloe lived in the moment, making decisions based on whatever felt right at the time. She had Dad's easy charm and Mom's ability to make friends instantly, but she'd never quite developed the sense of responsibility that came naturally to me. Throughout high school, while I was working part-time jobs and maintaining my grades for scholarship applications, Chloe was dating different boys, changing her mind about future plans every few months, and somehow always managing to talk her way out of consequences when things went wrong. Our parents had always handled Chloe with kid gloves, excusing her impulsive behavior as creativity and free-spiritedness. When she barely graduated high school and decided to take a gap year instead of going straight to college, they supported her decision and let her live at home rent-free while she figured out her next steps. That gap year had stretched into 2 years, then 3, with Chloe bouncing between part-time jobs at coffee shops and retail stores, never staying anywhere long enough to build real experience or financial stability. The apartment in Riverside Heights had become my sanctuary during those final years of college. After long days of classes and longer nights at Tony's, I'd come home to my own space where I could study in peace, decorate however I wanted, and prove to myself that I was capable of independent adult life. The rent wasn't cheap, especially on a student budget, but I'd made it work through careful planning and occasional help from my parents during particularly tight months. They'd never asked for the money back, treating it as an investment in my education and future. The neighborhood had been changing around me as I finished school. New restaurants were opening, trendy coffee shops were replacing the old diners, and young professionals were moving in as property values slowly climbed. I'd watched longtime residents move out as their rent increased, and new faces appeared in the apartment complex and surrounding buildings. The transformation was gradual enough that I'd adjusted to it without really thinking about what it might mean for my own future there. After graduation, landing my job at Digital Marketing Solutions, Inc. had felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked for. The company occupied 2 floors of a sleek office building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a break room that always seemed to be stocked with gourmet coffee and fresh fruit. My boss, Jennifer Walsh, was everything I hoped to become professionally: sharp, creative, and genuinely invested in helping her team grow. She'd taken a chance on me as a junior marketing coordinator, despite my limited professional experience, seeing potential in my college projects and the portfolio I'd built during my internships. The work was challenging in all the right ways. I was managing social media accounts for 3 different clients, creating content calendars, analyzing engagement metrics, and learning about digital advertising strategies that I'd only read about in textbooks. Jennifer had a policy of giving her team increasing responsibilities as they proved themselves capable, and I was determined to earn every opportunity she offered. The starting salary of $42,000 wasn't huge, but it was enough to cover my expenses while building savings for the future. My daily routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm. I'd wake up at 6:30, make coffee in the little kitchen with its white cabinets and tile countertops that I'd learned to love despite their age, and catch up on industry news while eating breakfast. The commute downtown took about 25 minutes on a good day, and I'd use the time to listen to marketing podcasts or plan my day. Work kept me busy and engaged, and I'd usually stay late when we had big campaigns launching or client presentations to prepare. Evenings were my own, and I'd developed a routine of cooking dinner while catching up on personal tasks, then settling in with my laptop to work on freelance projects that brought in extra income. I discovered that several small businesses in the area needed help with their social media presence, and word-of-mouth referrals had built me a steady stream of side work that paid well and kept my skills sharp. Between my full-time salary and freelance income, I was finally feeling financially secure for the first time in my adult life. The apartment felt like a real home by then. I'd slowly furnished it with pieces that reflected my personality rather than just what I could afford. A comfortable couch from a furniture outlet, artwork from local artists I'd discovered at weekend markets, plants that thrived in the bright, windows, and a dining table where I could spread out work projects or host the occasional dinner party for college friends who were still finding their footing in post-graduation life. Chloe would visit occasionally, usually when she needed something. She'd admire my independence while simultaneously making comments about how lonely it must be to live alone, how expensive everything was, how she couldn't imagine dealing with all the responsibilities of maintaining her own place. Her visits often felt like reconnaissance missions where she'd examine my possessions with a mix of admiration and envy, asking detailed questions about my rent, my job, my daily routines. I'd attributed her curiosity to sisterly interest, never suspecting that she might be cataloging information for future use. My parents visited more regularly, and I could see their pride in what I'd accomplished. Dad would inspect small repairs I'd made or improvements I'd added to the apartment, nodding approvingly at my growing competence with household management. Mom would bring groceries or homemade meals, ostensibly because she worried I wasn't eating well enough, but really because she enjoyed seeing me thriving in my own space. They'd both comment on how mature and responsible I'd become, how proud they were of the woman I was becoming. The neighborhood continued evolving around me, and I'd started noticing more dramatic changes. The old laundromat on the corner had closed and been replaced by an upscale boutique selling artisanal home goods. The family-owned grocery store where I'd shopped for 3 years had been bought by a chain and renovated with higher prices and products aimed at wealthier customers. Young couples with strollers had become common sights on the weekend, browsing the new shops and cafes that catered to their lifestyle and budget. My building itself had been showing signs of the changing times. The management company had started making improvements, fresh paint in the hallways, updated lighting in common areas, new locks on the front entrance. They'd sent notices about upcoming renovations to individual units, promising modernized kitchens and bathrooms, improved heating and cooling systems, and other amenities that would make the building more competitive in the current market. Most residents seemed excited about the improvements, and I'd looked forward to the upgrades that would make my apartment even more comfortable. The relationship with my family felt stable and positive during this period. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had become a regular tradition, with Chloe usually joining us along with her current boyfriend, Tyler Martinez. Tyler was a nice enough guy, working part-time at Walmart while supposedly saving money to start trade school. He and Chloe had been together for about 8 months, longer than most of her previous relationships, and he seemed to have a calming influence on her more impulsive tendencies. My parents liked him well enough, though I could tell Dad harbored some concerns about Tyler's lack of ambition and Chloe's continued financial dependence on them. These family gatherings were comfortable, and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Familiar, filled with updates about work and friends, discussions about current events, and Mom's efforts to ensure everyone was eating enough of her elaborate Sunday meals. Chloe would share stories about her various part-time jobs. Tyler would talk about his co-workers and plans for the future, and I'd update everyone on my professional projects and apartment life. The conversations flowed easily, and I felt grateful for the close relationships I maintained with my family despite living independently. Looking back, I can see warning signs that I missed at the time. Chloe's questions about my apartment had become more specific and frequent. She'd ask about my lease terms, my relationship with the landlord, the building's policies about guests, and subletting. Tyler had started joining these conversations, asking about the neighborhood's amenities, the cost of utilities, the convenience of my location for commuting to different parts of the city. I'd answered their questions openly, assuming they were just curious or possibly considering their own move out of my parents' house. There had also been subtle changes in my parents' behavior that I'd attributed to their natural concern about both their daughters' futures. They'd started asking more detailed questions about my finances, my job security, my long-term plans for career advancement. Dad had made several comments about the importance of family supporting each other through difficult times, and Mom had begun bringing up stories about relatives who'd helped each other through various challenges. These conversations had felt like natural expressions of parental concern, rather than preparation for what was coming. The apartment building's atmosphere had also been shifting in ways that didn't fully register at the time. Several long-time residents had moved out over the past few months, and new tenants were typically young professionals with higher incomes who could afford the gradually increasing rents. The building management had been sending more frequent communications about policies, renovations, and changes to lease terms. Some residents had started talking about rent increases and updated lease requirements, but these seemed like normal aspects of living in a desirable, improving neighborhood. My work life had been going well enough that I'd been focused on professional growth rather than potential challenges on the home front. Jennifer had started giving me more complex projects and had mentioned the possibility of a promotion to social media manager within the next few months. I'd been putting in extra hours to prove myself worthy of increased responsibilities and the salary bump that would come with advancement. The combination of my full-time job and freelance clients had kept me busy enough that I might have been less attentive to subtle family dynamics than I should have been. Financial planning had become something of a hobby for me during this period. I'd created detailed budgets tracking every expense, set up automatic transfers to savings accounts for different goals, and researched investment options for my growing emergency fund. The discipline I'd developed during college had carried over into my professional life, and I was proud of my ability to live comfortably within my means while building financial security for the future. This careful planning would soon prove more crucial than I could have imagined. The sense of independence and accomplishment I'd built over the previous year felt solid and sustainable. I'd proven to myself and my family that I could handle adult responsibilities, build a career, and maintain a comfortable home on my own terms. The apartment in Riverside Heights had become more than just a place to live. It was tangible evidence of my successful transition from college student to independent adult, a foundation for whatever came next in my personal and professional development. Everything seemed to be progressing exactly as I'd hoped and planned. My relationship with my family was strong. My career was advancing, and my living situation provided the perfect balance of independence and affordability. I felt grateful for the opportunities I'd been given and proud of how I'd made the most of them. The future looked bright and full of possibilities, and I was excited to see where my continued hard work and careful planning would take me next. The first sign that something was shifting came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was rushing to get ready for work when I heard the distinctive sound of mail being shoved through the slot in my apartment door. Usually, I'd grab it on my way out, but something about the way the envelope hit the floor made me pause. There was a weight to it, a thickness that suggested official business rather than the usual collection of promotional flyers and credit card offers. The envelope was cream-colored with the logo of Premier Property Group embossed in the corner. I'd never heard of them before, but the address was clearly for my building in Riverside Heights. My stomach did a small flip as I tore it open, already running late for a morning meeting with Jennifer about our biggest client's fall campaign. The letter was formal and direct in that way that immediately signals trouble. Premier Property Group had purchased my building along with several others in the neighborhood as part of their expansion into the Denver market. They were planning extensive renovations to bring all units up to luxury standards, which would include new kitchens, updated bathrooms, hardwood flooring throughout, and modern fixtures. The improvements sounded wonderful in theory, but the next paragraph made my coffee taste bitter in my mouth. Due to the scope of the renovations, all current leases would be terminated at the end of November. Residents would have the option to sign new leases at market rates once construction was completed, but there was no guarantee of being able to return. The new rental prices were listed at the bottom of the page, and my heart sank as I saw the numbers. What I was currently paying $800 for would cost $1,650 after the renovations. Even with my recent raise and freelance income, that was completely beyond my budget. I read the letter 3 times. Standing in my kitchen, watching the morning light stream through windows that suddenly felt less like home and more like a temporary stop. The 30-day notice meant I had until the end of October to find a new place, pack up 3 years of accumulated belongings, and somehow figure out how to afford Denver's increasingly expensive rental market. The timing couldn't have been worse, with the holidays approaching and most landlords preferring to wait until after New Year's to deal with new tenants. The drive to work that morning felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold while I remained detached from the actual experience. Downtown Denver looked the same as always, bustling with morning commuters and early joggers making their way through the urban landscape. But everything felt different, knowing that my stable foundation was crumbling beneath me. I found myself looking at apartment buildings differently, wondering which ones might have availability and whether I could afford them. Jennifer noticed my distraction during our meeting about the client campaign, though she was kind enough not to comment directly. I managed to get through the presentation of our social media strategy and timeline, but my usual enthusiasm for the creative elements felt forced and hollow. After the meeting, she asked if everything was okay, and I gave her some vague response about personal matters that I was working through. The truth felt too overwhelming to share with anyone yet, especially at work where I needed to maintain my professional reputation. That evening, I spread rental listings across my dining table like battle plans, trying to make sense of Denver's current housing market. Everything decent was priced well above what I could afford, and the few places within my budget were either in neighborhoods I didn't know or apartments so small that my current furniture wouldn't fit. I started making calculations about which possessions I could sell or store, which expenses I could cut, whether I could pick up additional freelance work to cover higher rent. The stress of keeping this information to myself felt heavier each day. During our usual Sunday dinner at my parents' house, I found myself distracted and quieter than normal. Mom kept asking if I was feeling well, and Dad made several comments about how tired I looked. Chloe was full of stories about her latest job at a boutique downtown, chattering about difficult customers and workplace drama with her characteristic, dramatic flair. Tyler nodded along supportively, occasionally adding his own observations about retail work from his experience at Walmart. The normalcy of the family dinner felt both comforting and surreal. Here we were, passing around Mom's pot roast and discussing weekend plans, while I was internally calculating whether I'd be able to afford anywhere to live by Christmas. Part of me wanted to share what was happening, to ask for advice or even temporary help, but another part of me was determined to handle this crisis independently. I'd worked so hard to establish myself as a capable adult, and admitting that I might need to move back home felt like admitting failure. Over the following days, I threw myself into apartment hunting with the same methodical approach I'd used for job searching after graduation. I created spreadsheets comparing different neighborhoods, commute times, and total monthly costs, including utilities. I scheduled viewings during lunch breaks and after work, sometimes seeing 3 or 4 places in a single evening. Most of the apartments I could afford were significant downgrades from my current situation, and several landlords seemed skeptical about my income level relative to their asking prices. The search was exhausting and demoralizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Landlords wanted first and last month's rent plus security deposits that sometimes equaled another month's payment. They requested pay stubs, bank statements, and references from previous landlords. Several required credit scores higher than mine, or income that was 3 times the monthly rent. The competition was fierce, with multiple applicants for every decent property, often including people with higher incomes or better rental histories than mine. Meanwhile, my family remained oblivious to my housing crisis. Chloe had started spending more time at Tyler's parents' house, often staying there for several days at a stretch before returning to our parents' place. She'd started talking about wanting her own space, but complained constantly about how expensive apartments were, and how unfair it was that young people couldn't afford to live independently anymore. The irony of her complaints wasn't lost on me as I struggled silently with the same issues she was theoretically concerned about. Tyler had been working more hours at Walmart, apparently saving money for something he was keeping secret from everyone, including Chloe. During family dinners, he'd mentioned picking up extra shifts and working weekends, but he was vague about his financial goals. Chloe teased him about being secretive, but she seemed pleased that he was showing more initiative about work and planning for their future together. My parents had been asking more questions about my apartment and living situation, but their inquiries felt casual rather than pointed. Dad wondered about my lease renewal timeline and whether I was planning to stay in Riverside Heights long-term. Mom asked about my neighbors and whether the building management was responsive to maintenance requests. Their questions seemed like normal parental interest, rather than preparation for anything specific, so I answered honestly about everything except the eviction notice. The stress was starting to affect other areas of my life. I was having trouble sleeping, often lying awake calculating potential moving expenses, or worrying about whether I'd find somewhere affordable before my deadline. My work performance was still solid, but I felt less creative and energetic than usual. Jennifer had mentioned the upcoming promotion opportunity again, but even that exciting prospect felt overshadowed by my housing uncertainty. 3 weeks. Into October, I was starting to panic about my limited options and shrinking timeline. I'd applied for several apartments but hadn't heard back from any of them, and the few places I could definitely afford were either in unsafe neighborhoods or so far from downtown that my commute would become unmanageable. I started researching month-to-month furnished rooms and extended stay hotels as temporary solutions while I continued searching for something permanent. The furnished room options were depressing and expensive for what they offered. Most were in houses with multiple tenants, shared bathrooms, and strict rules about guests and personal belongings. The extended stay hotels were clean but sterile, and the daily rates would add up to more than a decent apartment over time. Neither option would allow me to keep most of my furniture or maintain the sense of home I'd worked so hard to create. I was sitting at my kitchen table one Thursday evening, laptop open to rental listings and calculator in hand, when my phone rang with a call from Mom. Her voice had that particular tone that I'd learned to recognize over the years, somewhere between casual conversation and something more serious. She wanted to know if I was free for dinner on Saturday because they had something important to discuss with the family. Something about Chloe and Tyler's future that involved all of us. My first thought was that they were getting engaged, which would explain Tyler's secretive saving and extra work hours. It would also explain why my parents wanted a family meeting rather than just announcing news during our regular Sunday dinner. I felt genuinely happy for my sister despite my own problems, and I started thinking about what kind of engagement party we might plan and whether I'd be able to contribute meaningfully given my tight financial situation. The prospect of a family celebration actually lifted my spirits for the first time in weeks. Planning something positive would be a welcome distraction from apartment hunting, and focusing on Chloe's happiness might help put my own problems in perspective. I started mentally reviewing my schedule to see when I could help with party planning or shopping for gifts. Grateful for something cheerful to think about instead of constantly worrying about my housing situation. Friday at work was busy with campaign launches for 2 different clients, and I managed to lose myself in the creative problem-solving that I loved about marketing. Jennifer complimented my strategy presentation and mentioned again that the promotion decision would be made within the next few weeks. I felt optimistic about my chances, and the salary increase would certainly help with whatever housing solution I eventually found. The combination of career advancement and family celebration news was exactly the positive momentum I needed. That evening, I treated myself to takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and spent time organizing my apartment while I waited for Saturday's family dinner. Despite the uncertainty about my living situation, being in my own space still felt comforting and right. I'd worked hard to create this home, and even if I had to leave it soon, I was proud of what I'd accomplished. The experience of independent living had taught me valuable lessons about responsibility, budgeting, and personal resilience that would serve me well wherever I ended up next. Saturday afternoon, I drove to my parents' house with a bottle of wine and genuine excitement about whatever news Chloe and Tyler were planning to share. The familiar route through Lakewood felt soothing, and I found myself looking forward to one of Mom's elaborate dinners and the comfortable chaos of family conversation. It had been too long since we'd had something purely positive to celebrate, and I was ready to focus on someone else's good news instead of my own challenges. The house looked exactly the same as always when I pulled into the driveway, with Dad's carefully maintained flower beds and Mom's seasonal decorations on the front porch. Tyler's car was already there, and I could see movement through the kitchen window where Mom was undoubtedly putting finishing touches on what would certainly be an impressive meal. The normalcy and warmth of the scene felt like exactly what I needed after weeks of stress and uncertainty about my future. Walking up to the front door, I realized how much I'd missed feeling genuinely excited about family time rather than distracted by my own problems. Whatever Chloe and Tyler had to announce, I was determined to be fully present and supportive. They deserved to have their moment of happiness celebrated properly, and I needed the reminder that good things still happened even when individual circumstances felt overwhelming. The sound of laughter and conversation from inside the house confirmed that this was going to be one of those special family evenings that we'd all remember fondly. I knocked briefly before letting myself in with my key, calling out my arrival and mentally preparing to hear about engagement rings, wedding plans, or whatever other exciting developments my sister was ready to share with the family. The warmth and familiar smells of home cooking enveloped me as I stepped inside, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely optimistic about what the evening would bring. Mom appeared from the kitchen wearing her favorite apron and that particular smile she got when she was orchestrating something special for the family. She hugged me tightly and immediately started talking about the menu she'd planned, listing dishes that were clearly intended to mark this as a celebration rather than just another family dinner. Dad emerged from his workshop wiping his hands, on a rag, grinning in that way that suggested he was in on whatever surprise was coming and was pleased about it. Chloe and Tyler were sitting close together on the living room couch, and I noticed immediately that they both looked nervous and excited in equal measure. Chloe was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something more formal than her usual casual style, and Tyler was actually wearing a button-down shirt instead of his typical t-shirt and jeans. They both stood up when I entered the room, and I could see Chloe practically bouncing with whatever news she was holding back. The dinner itself was elaborate even by Mom's standards, with multiple courses and wine pairings that suggested she'd been planning this meal for weeks. The conversation flowed easily around topics of work, weather, and local news, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that everyone seemed to be carefully managing. Chloe kept glancing at Tyler with meaningful looks, and my parents seemed unusually attentive to every detail of our interactions, as if they were memorizing the evening for some important reason. After dessert, Dad suggested we move to the living room for coffee, and I could feel the energy in the room shift toward whatever announcement was coming. Chloe and Tyler exchanged one final look before she took a deep breath and smiled at all of us with genuine joy radiating from every part of her expression. The moment felt suspended and perfect, full of possibility and family love, and I was grateful to be part of whatever happiness was about to be shared. Tyler reached over and took Chloe's hand, giving her an encouraging nod that suggested whatever they were about to tell us had been thoroughly discussed and planned between them. The gesture was sweet and supportive in a way that made me appreciate how much he clearly cared about my sister's happiness and comfort. Whatever their news was, it was obviously something they'd decided on together and were genuinely excited to share with the family. Chloe looked around the room at each of us individually, her eyes bright with excitement, and maybe a touch of nervousness about our reactions. When her gaze met mine, I smiled encouragingly, hoping she could see how happy I was to witness whatever joy she was about to share. The anticipation was building beautifully, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, ready to celebrate whatever wonderful development was about to change our family dynamic in some positive way. The moment stretched out perfectly as Tyler squeezed Chloe's hand and she took another deep breath, clearly ready to transform this family gathering from a regular dinner into something much more memorable and significant. I could see Mom gripping Dad's arm with barely contained excitement, and Dad's face wore the expression of someone who was about to become even prouder of his children than he already was. The whole scene felt warm and loving and exactly right for whatever news was coming next. The words that came out of Chloe's mouth shattered the warm anticipation in the room like glass hitting concrete. She wasn't engaged, she was pregnant. 3 months along, she announced with a mixture of pride and defiance, and she and Tyler had been trying to figure out the best way to tell everyone. The silence that followed felt dense and heavy, filled with the sound of expectations crashing and recalibrating in real time. Mom's hand flew to her chest, and I watched her face cycle through surprise, concern, and then a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dad's expression went carefully blank in that way he'd perfected during difficult conversations at work, and Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. The coffee cups sat untouched on the table between us as we all processed this news that was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying, depending on how you looked at it. Chloe rushed to fill the silence with explanations about how happy they were, how they'd been planning this for months, how Tyler was going to apply for full-time positions, and they were both committed to being the best parents possible. Her words tumbled over each other in a cascade of defensive justification, and I realized she'd been expecting skepticism rather than pure celebration. The nervousness I'd attributed to engagement excitement had actually been anxiety about family judgment. Tyler finally found his voice and started talking about his plans to leave Walmart for something with better benefits and career potential. He mentioned having already started applications at several warehouses and delivery companies, places that offered health insurance and steady schedules that would work better with a baby on the way. His sincerity was touching, but I could see the overwhelming nature of his situation written across his face as clearly as if it were printed there. Mom recovered first, getting up to hug both of them and saying all the right things about babies, being blessings and how excited she was to be a grandmother. Her reaction seemed to unlock Dad's response, and he stood up to shake Tyler's hand and pull Chloe into one of his bear hugs. The initial shock was transforming into genuine family warmth, and I felt myself relaxing as I watched my parents embrace this unexpected development with characteristic grace. I added my own congratulations and hugs, telling them how excited I was to be an aunt and asking about due dates and doctor's appointments. Chloe brightened considerably as she talked about the baby's development and the symptoms she'd been experiencing. Tyler seemed to gain confidence as the conversation shifted toward practical planning rather than judgment, and he started sharing ideas about converting his parents' garage apartment into a family-friendly space. The evening evolved into an extended discussion about logistics, finances, and family support systems. Tyler's parents had apparently been informed the previous week and had offered their extra bedroom until the couple could find their own place. Mom immediately started talking about baby showers and nursery planning, while Dad asked practical questions about Tyler's job search timeline and health insurance coverage. The initial shock was giving way to the kind of detailed planning that characterized our family's approach to any major life change. As the conversation continued, I found myself thinking about my own housing situation with new perspective. Here was my sister facing the prospect of finding a place suitable for raising a child, while I was secretly scrambling to find anywhere I could afford to live alone. The irony felt sharp and complicated, though I couldn't quite articulate why. Their challenges were different from mine, but equally real, and watching Tyler's determination to step up and provide for his new family made me think about my own definitions of success and responsibility. The drive home that night gave me time to process both the pregnancy news and my ongoing apartment crisis. Chloe's announcement had certainly surprised everyone, but the family was already rallying around the young couple in ways that felt both heartwarming and slightly envious. They would have support systems and backup plans that I was trying to navigate entirely on my own. The contrast between their situation and mine felt stark in ways I was still trying to understand. Back in my apartment, surrounded by the rental listings and moving boxes I'd started packing, the evening's news took on different implications. I was happy for Chloe and Tyler, genuinely excited about becoming an aunt. But their announcement had also highlighted my own isolation in dealing with life changes. While they had family meetings and support networks, I was facing potential homelessness with spreadsheets and determination as my only allies. The next few weeks brought a flurry of activity as both situations developed simultaneously. Chloe's pregnancy became the central focus of family conversations, with detailed discussions about prenatal care, baby preparations, and timeline planning dominating our Sunday dinners. Tyler had successfully interviewed for a position at a logistics company with better pay and benefits, and their optimism about the future was infectious, even as I privately worried about their readiness for parenthood. Meanwhile, my apartment search was becoming increasingly desperate. November was approaching quickly, and I'd been rejected for 3 different places due to income requirements or credit criteria. The options within my budget were shrinking daily, and I was starting to seriously consider temporary solutions, like extended stay hotels or month-to-month rooms that would cost more than permanent apartments, but require less commitment from cautious landlords. The stress of keeping my housing crisis secret was becoming harder to manage. During family dinners, I found myself distracted and quiet, while everyone else planned baby preparations and discussed Tyler's new job. Several times I almost brought up my own situation, but something always held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was not wanting to overshadow Chloe's pregnancy with my problems, but I continued handling everything alone. Jennifer had noticed my distraction at work and finally asked directly if there was something going on that was affecting my performance. I gave her a vague explanation about family changes and personal transitions, but she looked skeptical. When she mentioned the promotion decision again, I realized that my housing stress was starting to impact the career advancement I'd worked so hard to achieve. The interconnected nature of my problems was becoming impossible to ignore. 10 days before my lease termination, I finally found a studio apartment in Capitol Hill that I could afford. Barely. It was half the size of my current place, in a building that had seen better decades, but it was clean and safe and available immediately. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed more interested in finding a responsible tenant than maximizing profit, and she accepted my application after a brief interview about my work and rental history. The relief of securing housing was immediately overshadowed by the logistics of moving everything I owned into a space that would barely accommodate my bed and desk. I spent that weekend sorting through 3 years' worth of belongings, deciding what was essential and what I could sell or donate. The process was emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated, like dismantling the adult life I'd worked so hard to build and reconstructing it in miniature. During this same period, Chloe and Tyler were dealing with their own housing challenges. Tyler's parents' garage apartment turned out to need more work than initially expected, and the timeline for making it baby-ready was getting complicated. Chloe was experiencing morning sickness that made her existing part-time job difficult, and they were both struggling with the financial pressure of preparing for a baby while trying to establish independent living arrangements. Family dinners became strategy sessions where Mom and Dad helped brainstorm solutions to Tyler and Chloe's various logistical challenges. There was talk about temporary financial support, help with apartment deposits, and even the possibility of them staying in the main house longer than originally planned. I listened to these conversations while mentally calculating my own moving expenses and trying to figure out how I'd fit my belongings into a space the size of their future nursery. The contrast between their supported problem-solving and my solitary crisis management felt increasingly difficult to ignore. They had family meetings, financial backup plans, and multiple generations invested in their success, while I was packing boxes alone and hoping my new landlord wouldn't change her mind before I signed the lease. The difference wasn't their fault, but it highlighted how differently we'd each approached adult independence and family relationships. 3 days before my move, Mom called to invite me to a special family dinner she was planning for the following Saturday. She wanted to celebrate Tyler's new job and discuss some exciting family developments that would benefit everyone involved. Her tone carried that particular enthusiasm she got when she was orchestrating something she thought would make everyone happy. And I agreed to come, despite having to reschedule time I'd planned to spend packing. The invitation felt like a welcome, distraction from my moving stress, and an opportunity to celebrate positive family news before my own life became significantly more complicated. I was looking forward to hearing about Tyler's job and whatever other developments Mom was excited to share. Maybe Chloe had found a solution to their housing situation, or perhaps there was news about baby preparations that had everyone excited. I spent the days leading up to the dinner finishing my packing and coordinating with the moving company I'd hired to transport my reduced belongings to Capitol Hill. The process of condensing my life into boxes that would fit in a studio apartment was more emotional than practical, requiring decisions about which possessions represented essential parts of my identity and which were simply taking up space I could no longer afford. My current apartment looked increasingly empty and echo-filled as I removed my furniture and personal touches. The morning light still came through the windows beautifully, but the space no longer felt like home with my belongings packed away and my life in transition. I found myself grieving not just the apartment itself, but the version of myself that had lived there confidently and independently for 3 years. The night before the family dinner, I stood in my nearly empty living room and tried to memorize the details of a place that had meant so much to my development as an adult. The hardwood floors that had convinced me to sign my first lease, the kitchen where I'd learned to cook real meals, the windows where I'd watched the neighborhood change around me, all of it was about to become someone else's experience while I started over in a space that felt like a significant step backward. Saturday morning brought the final walkthrough with my current landlord and the last-minute details of coordinating my move for the following Monday. Mr. Patterson was professional but distant, treating our interaction as a routine business transaction, rather than the end of my most significant period of independent living. His lack of sentimentality about my departure somehow made the transition feel more final and less personal than I'd expected. The drive to my parents' house that evening felt different than usual, weighted with the knowledge that I was arriving fresh from dismantling my adult life and preparing to start over in circumstances I'd never planned for. The familiar route through Lakewood looked the same as always, but I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes, less as a successful daughter visiting her family and more as someone whose life was currently held together by careful planning and stubborn determination. Mom's enthusiasm when I arrived was immediately apparent, and she pulled me aside to whisper about how excited everyone was going to be about the surprises she had planned for the evening. Her energy was infectious despite my own complicated emotions, and I tried to focus on whatever positive developments she was anticipating rather than my own housing transition. Family celebration seemed like exactly what I needed to lift my spirits before Monday's move. Dad greeted me with one of his characteristic bear hugs and asked about work in that way parents do when they're making conversation, but also genuinely checking on your well-being. I gave him the standard positive updates about client projects and workplace developments while carefully avoiding any mention of my personal circumstances. The disconnect between my professional success and housing instability felt too complicated to explain in casual conversation. Chloe and Tyler arrived shortly after me, both looking more relaxed and optimistic than they had at the pregnancy announcement. Dinner. Tyler was wearing a shirt with his new company's logo, obviously proud of his recent employment upgrade, and Chloe seemed to be feeling better physically as her first trimester symptoms began to ease. Their happiness was genuine and contagious, and I felt my own mood lifting as I watched them settle into their new roles as expectant parents. The dinner itself was another of Mom's elaborate productions, with multiple courses and careful attention to everyone's preferences and dietary needs. Chloe mentioned that she was finally able to enjoy food again after weeks of morning sickness, and Tyler talked enthusiastically about his training program and the colleagues he was getting to know. Their conversation was full of optimism about their future together and excitement about the practical aspects of preparing for parenthood. As we moved toward dessert, I could sense the anticipation building toward whatever announcement or surprise Mom had been planning. She and Dad kept exchanging meaningful glances, and there was an undercurrent of excitement that suggested something significant was about to be revealed. Chloe and Tyler seemed to be in on whatever was coming, occasionally smiling at each other in ways that suggested shared knowledge about the evening's direction. The moment felt suspended and full of possibility as Mom stood up to clear the dinner plates and suggested we move to the living room for coffee and dessert. Her movements had that purposeful quality that indicated we were transitioning toward the main event of the evening, whatever that might be. I found myself genuinely curious about what could have generated this level of family excitement and coordination. Dad helped carry dishes to the kitchen while making small talk about weekend plans and upcoming family obligations, but his casual conversation felt like preparation for something more substantial. Tyler was unusually quiet, and Chloe kept glancing at him with encouraging looks that suggested he might have a role to play in whatever announcement was coming. The dynamic felt orchestrated in ways that made me both curious and slightly nervous about what they'd all planned together. In the living room, Mom arranged us all strategically with Chloe and Tyler on the couch, Dad in his favorite armchair, and me on the ottoman where I'd have a clear view of everyone's reactions to whatever was about to unfold. The positioning felt deliberate, like she'd visualized this moment and wanted to ensure optimal impact for her announcement. Her excitement was practically radiating from every gesture as she served coffee and settled into her own chair. The anticipation in the room was building toward something that clearly involved all of us in ways I couldn't yet understand. Whatever news or plan they were about to share had obviously been carefully considered and thoroughly discussed among themselves, before including me in the conversation. I felt simultaneously excited to be part of whatever family development was coming, and slightly apprehensive about being the last to know about plans that apparently affected everyone. Mom cleared her throat and looked around the room with that particular expression she wore when she was about to deliver news that she believed would solve everyone's problems at once. Her hands smoothed her skirt in the nervous gesture I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood, and Dad leaned forward slightly in his chair, with the attentive posture that meant he was prepared to support whatever she was about to say. The anticipation had built to a crescendo that felt almost theatrical in its intensity. The words that came out of her mouth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They had found the perfect solution to Chloe and Tyler's housing situation, she announced with obvious pride in her problem-solving abilities. Maya's apartment in Riverside Heights would be ideal for a young family with a baby on the way. It was spacious enough for a nursery, in a safe neighborhood with good schools nearby, and close to Tyler's new job downtown. Everything about the location and layout made it perfect for their needs as new parents starting their life together. I sat frozen on the ottoman, my coffee cup suspended halfway to my lips, as she continued explaining their plan with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a brilliant strategy. Chloe and Tyler would take over my lease and move into the apartment immediately, which would give them time to prepare for the baby without the stress of apartment hunting. The timing was perfect since they needed somewhere stable to live, and I could move back home temporarily while I figured out my next steps as a single professional without the burden of maintaining such a large space. The silence that followed her announcement stretched endlessly as I processed what had just been said. My family had sat around this table and calmly planned to redistribute my living situation without consulting me, as if my apartment were a family asset rather than my personal home. They had discussed my future living arrangements, made decisions about my housing, and presented their conclusions as a fait accompli that would obviously make everyone happy once I understood the logic behind it. Chloe was beaming at Tyler with tears of relief in her eyes, and he was nodding enthusiastically as he thanked my parents for thinking of such a perfect solution to their housing crisis. Dad was explaining the financial benefits of the arrangement, how it would help everyone involved save money while providing Chloe and Tyler with the stability they needed during this important time in their lives. The conversation flowed around me as if my consent were a foregone conclusion rather than a necessary component of their plan. The irony of the situation was so overwhelming that I almost started laughing hysterically right there in the living room. Here was my family generously offering to give away something that I was already losing, solving a housing crisis for Chloe and Tyler while remaining completely oblivious to my own identical crisis. They were presenting as a gift something that would be vacant within days regardless of their intervention, and they had no idea that their perfect solution was based on circumstances that no longer existed. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the side table, taking extra time with the action to give myself a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't immediately explode into the kind of family argument that would overshadow Chloe's pregnancy and Tyler's new job. My hands were trembling slightly as I processed the layers of assumption and entitlement that had gone into their planning process. They had not only made decisions about my life without consulting me, but they had done so while remaining completely unaware of the actual facts of my situation. When I finally found my voice, it came out smaller and more controlled than I'd intended. I asked them when exactly they had planned to discuss this arrangement with me, since it seemed like they had already worked out all the details among themselves. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched their expressions shift from excited anticipation to confusion about why I wasn't immediately embracing their solution with gratitude and enthusiasm. Mom looked genuinely puzzled by my tone, explaining that they had assumed I would be happy to help my sister during such an important time in her life. Family helped family, she said, using the phrase that had been a cornerstone of our household philosophy throughout my childhood. She couldn't understand why I seemed hesitant about an arrangement that would benefit everyone involved, while strengthening our family bonds during this special period. Dad jumped in with practical explanations about how the transition would work smoothly for everyone involved. I could take my time moving back home, they said, and use the money I saved on rent to build up my savings account, or pursue other opportunities that might not have been financially feasible while I was paying for my own place. Living at home temporarily would give me flexibility to make strategic decisions about my future without the pressure of monthly housing expenses. The conversation continued swirling around me as they elaborated on their vision for how this arrangement would work out perfectly for everyone involved. Chloe and Tyler would have a stable home environment for bringing up their baby. I would have financial freedom and family support during whatever transition period I needed, and my parents would have the satisfaction of seeing both their daughters thriving with appropriate levels of assistance during important life changes. Tyler finally spoke up to say how grateful he was for the family's willingness to help them get started, and how hard he intended to work to prove himself worthy of their support. His sincerity was touching, but it made the situation even more complicated because his gratitude was based on a complete misunderstanding of the actual circumstances. He was thanking them for giving him something they didn't actually have the power to give, and his appreciation made it harder for me to explain why their plan was impossible. I realized I was going to have to tell them about the eviction notice, but the prospect of revealing that information in this context felt overwhelming. Not only would I have to admit that I'd been keeping a significant crisis secret from my family for weeks, but I would also have to destroy their excitement about solving Chloe and Tyler's housing problem while simultaneously revealing my own vulnerability and need for help. The weight of the secret I'd been carrying felt suddenly unbearable as I looked around the room at their expectant faces. They were waiting for me to express gratitude for their generosity and enthusiasm for their plan, completely unaware that everything they thought they knew about my situation was wrong. The gap between their assumptions and reality felt like a chasm that I was going to have to cross in order to have an honest conversation about anyone's actual circumstances. I took a deep breath and told them there was something important they needed to know before making any final decisions about the apartment situation. The tone of my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of what I was about to say, because the cheerful family planning atmosphere shifted immediately toward concern and attention. Mom leaned forward with the expression she wore when one of us was about to confess to breaking something valuable or getting in trouble at school. The eviction notice came out of my purse like evidence in a criminal trial, cream-colored and official and completely destructive to every assumption they'd been operating under. I handed it to Dad, who read it silently before passing it to Mom, and watched their faces change as they processed the information that made their perfect plan impossible. The apartment they were generously giving to Chloe and Tyler was going to be vacant by the end of November, regardless of anyone's family planning. The silence that followed was different from the anticipatory quiet that had preceded Mom's announcement. This was the heavy silence of plans crashing and expectations recalibrating in real time, mixed with the particular tension that comes when families realize they've been operating with incomplete information. I could see each of them working through the implications of what the notice meant, not just for their plans, but for my situation that I'd been handling entirely alone. Mom was the first to find her voice, asking why I hadn't told them about the eviction notice when it first arrived. Her tone carried hurt along with confusion, and I could see that my secrecy felt like a betrayal of the family transparency they thought we maintained. The question forced me to examine my own motivations for keeping the crisis private, and I wasn't sure I could articulate the complex mixture of pride, independence, and fear that had driven my decision to handle everything alone. I tried to explain that I'd wanted to solve the problem myself, that I'd been working on finding alternative housing and hadn't wanted to worry everyone with something I thought I could handle independently. The explanation sounded weak even to my own ears, and I could see from their expressions that they felt excluded from something they should have been part of from the beginning. My attempt at independent problem-solving had created exactly the kind of family disconnect I'd been trying to avoid. Dad asked about my apartment search and what options I'd found, and I had to admit that my new studio apartment in Capitol Hill was a significant downgrade from my current situation. The details of my housing solution made it clear that I was struggling financially in ways they hadn't realized, and that my apparent success and independence had been masking a more precarious situation than anyone had understood. Chloe looked devastated as she realized that their housing solution had evaporated along with my stability, and Tyler seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of problems that suddenly felt much more difficult to solve. The evening that had begun, with optimism about family support and perfect timing, had devolved into a crisis planning session where everyone's assumptions had proven wrong, and no one's problems had obvious solutions. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd ever had, characterized by honesty about financial pressures, career uncertainties, and the gaps between public success and private struggles. I found myself explaining the Denver rental market, the challenges of finding affordable housing on a single income, and the stress of trying to maintain professional credibility while dealing with personal instability. They listened with expressions of concern and surprise, clearly realizing that my adult life was more complicated than they'd understood. Mom started immediately brainstorming alternative solutions, talking about temporary arrangements and family support systems that could help both Chloe and me navigate our respective housing challenges. Her instinct to solve problems kicked in automatically, and she began coordinating potential resources and strategies with the same energy she'd brought to planning the apartment transfer that was no longer possible. Dad was more focused on understanding why I'd felt unable to share my crisis with them earlier, and his questions pushed me to examine my own assumptions about independence and family relationships. His concern was genuine, but it also carried a subtle disappointment that I'd excluded them from something as significant as potential homelessness. The conversation forced me to confront my own pride and fear about appearing unsuccessful despite my professional achievements. The evening extended well past our usual family dinner timeline as we worked through the practical and emotional implications of everyone's actual situations, rather than the assumptions we'd been operating under. Chloe and Tyler had to recalibrate their expectations about timeline and support, while I had to acknowledge that my determination to handle everything alone had created unnecessary stress for everyone involved. By the time we started clearing coffee cups and dessert plates, a new understanding had emerged about the complexity of adult life and the value of family communication during difficult transitions. No one's problems had been magically solved, but we'd established a foundation for honest conversation about challenges and support that felt more sustainable than the previous pattern of assumptions and secret crisis management. The drive back to my nearly empty apartment that night gave me time to process the evening's revelations and their implications for my relationships with my family. The prospect of moving to Capitol Hill the following Monday felt less isolating, knowing that my family understood my actual circumstances and were invested in helping me navigate whatever came next. The apartment that had felt like evidence of my independence now seemed like a stepping stone toward a different kind of stability. Over the following weeks, as I settled into my studio apartment and Chloe and Tyler figured out their own housing situation with increased family support, the crisis that had brought our assumptions crashing down became the foundation for more honest relationships. My parents visited my new place and saw firsthand the reality of Denver's housing market for young professionals, while Chloe and Tyler found a small apartment near his work with help from both sets of parents. The experience taught all of us about the importance of honest communication during difficult times and the ways that pride can interfere with family support when it's most needed. My determination to handle everything independently had been admirable in some ways, but counterproductive in others. And learning to balance autonomy with family connection became an ongoing process rather than a problem with a simple solution. Months later, as I settled into a larger apartment that I could afford with the promotion Jennifer had given me, I realized that the housing crisis had ultimately strengthened my family relationships rather than damaging them. The honesty that had emerged from necessity became a new standard for how we communicated about challenges and changes, and the support systems we developed served everyone better than the previous pattern of assumptions and independence. Chloe's baby was born healthy and beautiful, and watching her navigate parenthood with Tyler's support and the family's involvement reminded me that different people need different types of help at different times in their lives. My journey toward financial stability and career success looked different from theirs, but both paths were valid and deserving of family support when circumstances required it. The apartment in Riverside Heights was eventually renovated and rented to a young couple who could afford the new rates, and sometimes when I drove through the neighborhood, I would see them walking their dog or bringing in groceries. The sight didn't make me sad anymore, but rather reminded me that homes are created by the people who live in them rather than the specific buildings that house them. My studio apartment in Capitol Hill became a launching pad for the next phase of my adult life, and the experience of downsizing and starting over taught me valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation that served me well in both personal and professional contexts. The crisis that had felt overwhelming at the time became a source of strength and confidence that I carried forward into future challenges. The family dinners at my parents' house continued as a regular tradition, but with a new depth of honest communication about our individual struggles and successes. We learned to ask for help when we needed it and offer support without assuming. We knew what others required, creating a more sustainable pattern of interdependence that honored both individual autonomy and family connection. Looking back, I can see that the eviction notice that had felt like a disaster was actually the catalyst for positive changes in how my family related to each other during difficult times. The honesty that emerged from crisis became the foundation for stronger relationships, and the support systems we developed served all of us better than the previous pattern of independence and assumption. The experience reminded me that sometimes the things that feel like failures or setbacks are actually opportunities for growth and deeper connection, and that family support works best when it's based on honest communication about actual circumstances, rather than assumptions about what others need or want. The apartment may have been lost, but the relationships that emerged from that loss were stronger and more authentic than what had existed before. The room fell into a silence so profound that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away seconds that felt like hours. Mom's face had gone pale as she processed the eviction notice, and Dad was rubbing his forehead in that way he did when trying to solve particularly complex accounting problems at work. Chloe looked like she was about to cry, and Tyler appeared to be calculating something in his head, probably trying to figure out how this development affected their timeline for finding somewhere to live before the baby arrived. I watched my family absorb the information that had just shattered their carefully constructed plan, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because I no longer had to carry this secret alone, but anxiety because I could see the disappointment and concern spreading across their faces as they realized how much I'd been struggling without asking for help. The weight of weeks of solitary problem-solving suddenly felt heavier now that it was shared knowledge rather than my private burden. Mom was the first to break the silence, asking me why I hadn't told them about the eviction notice when it first arrived in September. Her voice carried a hurt that I hadn't expected, and I realized that my decision to handle everything independently had felt like a rejection of family support, rather than an expression of adult responsibility. The question forced me to examine my own motivations, and I wasn't entirely sure I could explain the complex mixture of pride, fear, and determination that had driven my secrecy. I tried to articulate my reasoning, explaining that I'd wanted to prove I could handle adult problems without running home for help every time something went wrong. The explanation sounded inadequate even to my own ears, and I could see from their expressions that they were hurt by my assumption that they would see my housing crisis as failure rather than a challenge they could help me navigate. My attempt to protect them from worry had actually created the kind of family disconnect I'd been trying to avoid. Dad leaned forward and asked about my apartment search, and I found myself detailing the frustrating weeks of applications, rejections, and compromises that had led to my studio apartment in Capitol Hill. As I described the downsizing process, the financial calculations, and the emotional difficulty of condensing my life into a space half the size of what I was leaving, I could see them beginning to understand the scope of what I'd been managing alone. The studio apartment details seemed to surprise them most of all. When I mentioned the rent comparison and the neighborhood change, Mom asked why I hadn't considered moving back home temporarily while I looked for something better. The question highlighted the fundamental difference in how we'd been approaching the problem. They saw family support as a natural first step, while I'd viewed it as a last resort that would represent personal failure. Chloe finally spoke up, her voice small and guilty as she asked if my housing situation meant they shouldn't have gotten pregnant. The question broke my heart because it revealed how she was processing this information, not as my independent, adult problem, but as something that her life choices had somehow complicated. I immediately reassured her that my housing crisis had nothing to do with her pregnancy, that these were separate challenges that had unfortunately coincided in timing. Tyler looked overwhelmed as he processed the implications of both situations simultaneously. He started talking about postponing their move-out timeline, maybe staying with his parents longer than planned so that financial resources could be redirected toward helping me instead. His willingness to sacrifice for my situation was touching, but it also highlighted how my secrecy had created unnecessary complexity for everyone involved. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd ever had before. Instead of the usual surface-level updates about work and social activities, we found ourselves talking honestly about financial pressure, career uncertainty, and the gap between public appearances and private struggles. I explained the Denver rental market from a perspective they hadn't considered, detailing how rising property values and gentrification were affecting young professionals like me. Mom started immediately brainstorming alternative solutions with the energy she brought to any family crisis. She talked about temporary living arrangements, potential financial assistance, and ways to combine resources that might help both Chloe and me navigate our respective housing challenges more successfully. Her problem-solving instincts kicked in automatically, and I could see her mental wheels turning as she calculated different scenarios and possibilities. Dad was more focused on understanding the systemic issues that had created these problems in the first place. He asked detailed questions about rental application processes, income requirements, and the timeline pressures I'd been facing. His accountant's mind was working through the numbers, trying to understand how someone with a good job and responsible financial habits could still struggle to secure adequate housing in the current market. As the evening wore on, our conversation evolved into something deeper than crisis management. We started talking about expectations, both the ones I'd placed on myself about independent success and the ones they'd developed about my ability to handle everything without support. The discussion revealed assumptions on all sides that had prevented us from communicating effectively about real challenges and needs. I found myself explaining the pressure I'd felt to maintain the image of successful independence, especially as the older sister who was supposed to set a good example. The fear of disappointing them or appearing less capable than they believed had driven many of my decisions about handling problems alone. This revelation seemed to surprise them because they'd had no idea that their pride in my achievements had translated into pressure for me to never need help. Chloe shared her own feelings about being the younger sister who hadn't achieved the same level of early success, and how that had affected her decision-making about everything from career choices to the timing of her pregnancy. Her honesty about feeling overshadowed by my apparent competence added another layer to our family dynamics that we'd never explicitly discussed before. Tyler contributed his perspective as someone who'd joined our family recently and observed our interactions with fresh eyes. He mentioned noticing the different standards and expectations that seemed to apply to Chloe and me, and how those differences had influenced his assumptions about what kind of support would be appropriate to offer or accept from my parents. The conversation extended well into the evening as we worked through years of unexamined assumptions and unexpressed concerns. What had started as a crisis meeting about housing logistics became a comprehensive examination of how we communicated about difficulties and support within our family structure. None of the practical problems were immediately solved, but we established a foundation for more honest, ongoing dialogue. By the time we started clearing dishes and tidying up, a new understanding had emerged about the complexity of adult-family relationships and the importance of transparency during challenging transitions. My parents acknowledged that their pride in my independence had inadvertently created pressure for me to never admit when I needed help, while I recognized that my determination to handle everything alone had deprived them of opportunities to provide meaningful support. The following weeks brought a series of practical adjustments as we all adapted to this new level of honesty about challenges and needs. My parents visited my studio apartment in Capitol Hill, seeing firsthand the reality of what Denver's housing market offered to young professionals with moderate incomes. Their shock at the size and condition of what I could afford helped them understand the scope of the housing crisis affecting people my age. Chloe and Tyler found their own small apartment near his new job, with assistance from both sets of parents. But the process took longer and required more family coordination than anyone had initially expected. The experience of helping them navigate rental applications and lease negotiations gave my parents insight into how much the housing market had changed since they were young adults establishing their own independence. My studio apartment gradually became more comfortable as I learned to maximize the small space and appreciate the advantages of living in Capitol Hill. The neighborhood was walkable and culturally vibrant in ways that Riverside Heights had never been, and I discovered coffee shops, restaurants, and community spaces that enriched my daily life despite the reduced square footage of my living space. The financial pressure of higher rent relative to space was offset somewhat by reduced commuting costs and the ability to walk or bike to many activities that had previously required driving. I also discovered that living in a smaller space forced me to be more intentional about possessions and activities, leading to a lifestyle that was less cluttered and more focused on experiences rather than accumulating things. Work became even more important as a source of stability and growth during this transitional period. Jennifer had noticed my increased dedication and focus, and she started giving me more complex projects that showcased my abilities to clients and senior management. The promotion she'd mentioned became reality faster than expected, bringing both increased responsibility and a salary boost that made my housing situation more sustainable. The new role as social media manager came with oversight of a team of junior coordinators and direct client interaction that stretched my professional skills in exciting ways. I found myself managing campaign budgets that exceeded my annual salary, developing strategies for brands I'd admired as a consumer, and presenting ideas to executives who made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions in revenue. The professional growth that emerged from this challenging period taught me valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation that served me well beyond the immediate housing crisis. Learning to thrive despite reduced space and increased financial pressure built confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise in the future, both personally and professionally. My relationship with my family evolved significantly during this period of increased honesty and mutual support. Sunday dinners became more substantive conversations about real challenges and achievements, rather than polite updates about surface-level activities. We learned to ask for help when we needed it and offer assistance without assuming we knew what others required or wanted. Chloe's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and watching her navigate the physical and emotional changes of expecting her first child reminded me that different life stages require different types of support and understanding. Her needs were immediate and practical in ways that mine were more long-term and strategic, but both sets of challenges deserved family attention and resources. Tyler's adjustment to full-time work and impending fatherhood was impressive to witness. The responsibility of providing for his growing family motivated him to develop professional skills and work habits that transformed his entire approach to career development. His commitment to supporting Chloe and their baby created positive changes that benefited everyone around them. My parents' response to both their daughters facing adult challenges simultaneously taught them about the complexity of modern young adult life and the importance of flexible support systems. They learned to offer help without strings attached and to respect our autonomy while remaining available for guidance and assistance when requested. The housing crisis that had felt overwhelming and isolating when I faced it alone became manageable when addressed as a family challenge that required creative solutions and mutual support. The experience taught all of us about the difference between independence and isolation, and how healthy family relationships can provide security without compromising individual growth and achievement. 6 months after the eviction notice had first arrived, I was settled into a routine that felt sustainable and rewarding despite being different from what I'd originally planned. The studio apartment had become a launching pad for professional advancement, rather than a symbol of reduced circumstances, and the neighborhood offered community connections that enriched my social life in unexpected ways. Chloe gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named David, and becoming an aunt added a new dimension to my understanding of family relationships and responsibilities. Holding my nephew for the first time, seeing the love and determination in Chloe and Tyler's faces as they adapted to parenthood, reminded me that families grow and change in ways that require flexibility and support from all members. The experience of helping with baby preparations, offering practical assistance with childcare, and watching David's development added joy and purpose to my life that I hadn't anticipated. Being the aunt who lived independently but remained closely connected to family activities felt like the perfect balance of autonomy and involvement. My career continued advancing as I proved myself capable of handling increased responsibility and complex client relationships. The promotion led to additional opportunities, including speaking at industry conferences and consulting for companies outside our regular client base. The professional reputation I built during this period became the foundation for future career growth that exceeded my original expectations. The financial stability that came with career advancement eventually enabled me to move to a larger apartment in Capitol Hill, still not as spacious as my original place in Riverside Heights, but comfortable and well located for my lifestyle and budget. The process of upgrading my living situation felt like a genuine achievement, rather than simply returning to a previous standard of living. Looking back, I can see that the eviction notice that had initially felt like a disaster was actually the catalyst for positive changes in multiple areas of my life. The crisis forced honest communication with my family, accelerated my professional development, and taught me valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation that served me well in subsequent challenges. The apartment in Riverside Heights was eventually renovated and rented to a young couple who could afford the new rates, part of the ongoing gentrification that was transforming neighborhoods throughout Denver. Occasionally, I would drive through the area and see new businesses, updated buildings, and different demographics that reflected the city's growth and change. These observations didn't make me sad anymore, but rather reminded me that cities and lives are constantly evolving, and success comes from adapting to change rather than trying to preserve specific circumstances indefinitely. The experience taught me to appreciate stability while remaining flexible about the forms that security and happiness might take. My family relationships had been strengthened by the honesty that emerged from crisis, and we maintained the pattern of open communication about challenges and support that had developed during those difficult months. Sunday dinners continued as a regular tradition, but with deeper conversations about real struggles and achievements rather than polite surface-level updates. The experience reminded me that family support works best when it's based on honest communication about actual circumstances rather than assumptions about what others need or want. The willingness to be vulnerable about difficulties and to ask for help when necessary became a source of strength rather than an admission of weakness. Years later, when other friends and colleagues faced housing crises, career transitions, or family challenges, I was able to offer both practical advice and emotional support based on my own experience of navigating uncertainty with family help. The crisis that had felt isolating and overwhelming at the time became a source of wisdom and connection that enriched my relationships and community involvement. The studio apartment in Capitol Hill eventually became a stepping stone to home ownership when I'd saved enough for a down payment and established sufficient credit history and income stability to qualify for a mortgage. The house I eventually bought was small but entirely mine, representing a different kind of security and independence than I'd originally imagined, but no less meaningful for being unexpected. David grew from a tiny infant into a curious toddler, who brought joy and laughter to family gatherings. And watching Chloe and Tyler develop as parents reminded me continuously of the importance of family support during major life transitions. Their success as a young family was built on the foundation of honest communication and mutual assistance that had emerged from our collective housing crisis. The eviction notice remained in my files as a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how important it is to maintain both independence and connection with people who care about your welfare. The experience taught me to plan for uncertainty, while remaining open to support when challenges exceed individual capacity to handle them alone. The Denver rental market continued evolving, becoming even more expensive and competitive as the city's population and economy grew. Young professionals arriving after me faced even greater challenges in finding affordable housing, and I often shared my experience and advice with newcomers navigating similar difficulties in a market that seemed designed to exclude rather than welcome people without significant financial resources. These conversations reminded me that individual housing crises are often symptoms of larger systemic issues that require collective solutions and community support. The personal resilience and family connections that had helped me navigate my own challenges were important, but they were not sufficient to address the broader affordability crisis affecting entire generations of young adults. The experience ultimately taught me that true security comes not from avoiding all difficulties, but from developing the skills, relationships, and resources necessary to navigate challenges successfully when they arise. The apartment may have been lost, but the growth, connections, and wisdom that emerged from that loss proved more valuable and durable than any specific living situation could have been. The morning after our family revelation brought a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in months. I woke up in my nearly empty apartment, knowing that my parents finally understood the full scope of what I'd been facing, and the relief of shared knowledge felt almost physical. The sunlight streaming through my windows looked different somehow, less like illumination of a temporary space, and more like the beginning of something new and potentially better than what I was leaving behind. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom asking if she could come over to help with packing, and I realized that accepting her offer wouldn't diminish my independence, but rather acknowledge that family support and personal autonomy could coexist in healthy ways. When she arrived an hour later with coffee, pastries, and an assortment of moving supplies I hadn't thought to buy, I felt grateful for her presence in ways that surprised me with their intensity. We worked together wrapping dishes and folding clothes, and our conversation naturally evolved into discussions about my future plans that went beyond immediate housing logistics. Mom asked about my career goals, my social life, and my dreams for the next few years with genuine curiosity rather than parental assessment. The shift in how she engaged with my adult decisions felt significant, as if our crisis had matured, our relationship in ways that normal circumstances might not have achieved. Dad arrived around lunchtime with his truck and Tyler, who had volunteered to help with the heavy lifting, despite having his own moving preparations to manage. The sight of Tyler showing up to assist with my transition, knowing that his own housing situation remained uncertain, highlighted the way crisis can bring out both selfishness and generosity in people. His willingness to help despite his own challenges spoke to the kind of character that would serve him well as a husband and father. As we loaded boxes and furniture into Dad's truck, I found myself having honest conversations with Tyler about the realities of adult financial management, career development, and the importance of building emergency funds for unexpected circumstances. Our discussion felt more like peer consultation than older sister advice, and I realized that my recent experiences had taught me lessons that might be valuable to someone just beginning similar challenges. The drive to Capitol Hill with the first load of my possessions gave me time to process the neighborhood I was joining as a resident, rather than just a visitor. The area had an energy and diversity that Riverside Heights had lacked, with street art, independent bookstores, and restaurants representing cuisines from around the world. The cultural richness felt like compensation for the reduced square footage I was accepting in my living space. My new studio apartment looked impossibly small when we started unloading boxes, but Mom immediately began suggesting organizational strategies that would maximize both storage and livability. Her practical experience managing household spaces proved invaluable as we figured out furniture placement and storage solutions that I wouldn't have considered on my own. The collaborative problem-solving felt natural and supportive rather than intrusive or controlling. Tyler proved surprisingly helpful with assembling furniture and organizing the kitchen area, and his enthusiasm for the project seemed genuine, rather than obligatory. As we worked together, he shared his own anxieties about providing adequate housing for Chloe and their baby, and I found myself offering encouragement and practical suggestions based on my recent intensive education in Denver's rental market. By evening, my studio apartment had been transformed from an empty box into a functional living space that felt more like home than I'd expected. The strategic furniture placement and creative storage solutions had created distinct areas for sleeping, working, and relaxing despite the limited square footage. Looking around at what we'd accomplished together, I felt optimistic about this new chapter, rather than nostalgic for what I was leaving behind. Chloe arrived as we were finishing up, bringing dinner from a nearby restaurant and obvious curiosity about my new neighborhood and living situation. Her pregnancy was showing more now, and watching her navigate the narrow stairs to my apartment reminded me of the practical challenges she and Tyler would face in their own housing search. The studio that felt cozy for one person would be impossible for a family with an infant. Our conversation over dinner touched on topics we'd never discussed as sisters, including financial planning, career priorities, and the emotional challenges of major life transitions. Chloe admitted that she'd been envious of my apparent financial stability and independence, while I acknowledged that her willingness to embrace major changes like pregnancy and marriage required a different kind of courage than I possessed. The honesty that had emerged from our family crisis was creating space for more authentic relationships, and I found myself appreciating aspects of Chloe's personality that I'd previously viewed as irresponsibility. Her optimism about the future and willingness to adapt to changing circumstances were strengths that complemented my tendency toward careful planning and risk management. Tyler contributed insights about the pressure young men face to provide financial security for their families and how that pressure can create anxiety that interferes with decision-making and relationship dynamics. His perspective added depth to my understanding of the challenges facing young couples starting families in expensive cities like Denver, where traditional markers of adult success seem increasingly difficult to achieve. As my family prepared to leave that evening, the atmosphere felt different from our usual farewells. Instead of polite expressions of family affection, there was genuine appreciation for shared effort and mutual support during a difficult transition. The crisis had stripped away some of the surface politeness that had characterized our interactions and replaced it with more substantive connection. The following weeks brought a series of adjustments as I adapted to studio living while maintaining my professional responsibilities and helping Chloe and Tyler navigate their own housing search. The reduced space required more intentional organization and daily routines, but it also created opportunities for simplicity and focus that I hadn't anticipated. My morning routine became more streamlined without multiple rooms to navigate, and I discovered that having everything within easy reach actually increased my efficiency in getting ready for work. The constraint of limited space forced me to be more selective about possessions and activities, leading to a lifestyle that felt more purposeful and less cluttered than what I'd maintained in larger apartments. The Capitol Hill neighborhood offered walking access to coffee shops, restaurants, and cultural venues that enriched my daily life in ways that suburban Riverside Heights never had. I found myself exploring art galleries, attending community events, and discovering local businesses that reflected the area's creative and diverse character. The vibrancy of street life provided social connection even when I was spending evenings alone. Work continued to be a source of stability and growth during this transitional period, and Jennifer's recognition of my dedication led to increasingly complex and high-profile assignments. Managing social media campaigns for major clients required skills and confidence that I'd been developing throughout my career. But the personal resilience I'd built during my housing crisis enhanced my professional capabilities in unexpected ways. The promotion to social media manager came with oversight responsibilities that challenged me to develop leadership and communication skills beyond my previous scope of work. Training junior coordinators, presenting strategies to clients, and managing campaign budgets required a level of professional maturity that I might not have achieved without the personal growth forced by recent challenges. Client relationships became more collaborative and strategic as I demonstrated ability to understand their business objectives and translate them into effective digital marketing approaches. The confidence I'd gained from successfully navigating personal crisis seemed to enhance my professional presence and decision-making capabilities in ways that impressed both colleagues and clients. Evening freelance projects continued providing additional income and skill development opportunities, and working from my studio apartment actually improved my focus and productivity compared to the distractions available in a larger space. The constraint of limited room meant that work time was dedicated entirely to professional tasks, rather than being diluted by household projects or entertainment options. Financial management became even more important given the higher rent relative to space, and I developed budgeting and saving strategies that maximized my resources while building security for future transitions. The discipline required to live comfortably within tight constraints taught me valuable lessons about distinguishing between wants and needs that served me well beyond immediate circumstances. Family relationships continued evolving as we all adjusted to the new level of honesty and mutual support that had emerged from our collective crisis. Sunday dinners became occasions for substantive conversations about real challenges and achievements rather than polite updates about surface-level activities. The depth of connection felt more satisfying and sustainable than our previous pattern of cheerful superficiality. Chloe's pregnancy progressed with typical ups and downs, and I found myself serving as both emotional support and practical resource as she and Tyler prepared for parenthood. My recent experience with major life transitions gave me perspective on the importance of flexibility and family support during periods of significant change, and I was able to offer encouragement based on genuine understanding rather than theoretical advice. Tyler's adaptation to full-time work and impending fatherhood was impressive to witness, and his commitment to providing for his growing family created positive changes in his approach to career development and financial planning. The responsibility of supporting Chloe and their baby motivated him to develop professional skills and work habits that exceeded everyone's expectations, including his own. Their apartment search eventually led to a small 2-bedroom unit in a neighborhood between downtown and the suburbs, offering reasonable rent and good access to Tyler's workplace while providing space for a nursery and family life. The process of finding their place required assistance from both sets of parents, but the support felt collaborative rather than enabling, focused on helping them establish independence rather than prolonging dependence. My parents' response to both daughters facing adult challenges simultaneously taught them about the complexity of modern young adult life and the importance of flexible support systems. They learned to offer help without strings attached and to respect our autonomy while remaining available for guidance and assistance when requested, rather than assuming they knew what we needed. The housing crisis that had felt overwhelming, when faced individually, became manageable when addressed as a family challenge requiring creative solutions and mutual support. The experience taught all of us about the difference between independence and isolation, and how healthy family relationships can provide security without compromising individual growth and achievement. Spring brought opportunities for reflection on the changes that had occurred since the eviction notice first arrived the previous fall. My studio apartment had become a comfortable home base that supported both professional advancement and personal growth, while the Capitol Hill neighborhood had provided cultural richness and community connections that enhanced my quality of life despite reduced living space. Chloe gave birth to David in early April, and becoming an aunt added dimensions to my understanding of family relationships and responsibilities that I hadn't anticipated. Holding my nephew for the first time, seeing the love and determination in Chloe and Tyler's faces as they adapted to parenthood reminded me that families grow and change in ways that require flexibility and support from all members. The experience of helping with baby preparations, offering practical assistance with childcare, and watching David's development added joy and purpose to my life that complemented my professional achievements and personal independence. Being the aunt who lived independently but remained closely connected to family activities felt like the perfect balance of autonomy and involvement. Career advancement continued as I proved myself capable of handling increased responsibility and complex client relationships, and the promotion led to additional opportunities including speaking at industry conferences and consulting for companies outside our regular client base. The professional reputation I built during this challenging period became the foundation for future growth that exceeded my original expectations. Summer brought the possibility of moving to a larger apartment within Capitol Hill as my increased salary and proven rental history made me a more attractive tenant for better properties. The process of apartment hunting felt completely different this time, characterized by choice rather than desperation, and supported by family understanding rather than managed in isolation. The one-bedroom apartment I eventually secured was still smaller than my original place in Riverside Heights, but felt spacious compared to the studio, and it offered amenities like a separate kitchen and bedroom that significantly improved my daily comfort and functionality. The upgrade represented genuine progress rather than simply returning to a previous standard of living. Financial stability that came with career advancement eventually enabled me to start building savings toward home ownership, a goal that had seemed impossible during the crisis, but now appeared achievable within a reasonable timeline. The discipline I'd developed living within tight constraints had created habits that served me well, even when resources became more abundant. The experience of successfully navigating major upheaval had built confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise in the future, both personally and professionally. The resilience and adaptability I'd developed became assets that enhanced every aspect of my life, from career advancement to relationship building to community involvement. Looking back a year after the eviction notice had first arrived, I could see that what had initially felt like a disaster had actually been the catalyst for positive changes in multiple areas of my life. The crisis had forced honest communication with my family, accelerated my professional development, and taught me valuable lessons about resilience and community that served me well in subsequent challenges. The apartment in Riverside Heights had been renovated and rented to a young couple who could afford the new rates, part of the ongoing gentrification transforming neighborhoods throughout Denver. Occasionally driving through the area, I could see new businesses, updated buildings, and different demographics reflecting the city's growth and change. But these observations no longer made me sad. Instead, seeing the evolution of my former neighborhood reminded me that cities and lives are constantly changing, and success comes from adapting to change rather than trying to preserve specific circumstances indefinitely. The experience had taught me to appreciate stability while remaining flexible about the forms that security and happiness might take. Family relationships had been permanently strengthened by the honesty that emerged from crisis, and we maintained the pattern of open communication about challenges and support that had developed during those difficult months. The willingness to be vulnerable about difficulties and to ask for help when necessary had become a source of strength rather than an admission of weakness. Years later, when friends and colleagues faced housing crises, career transitions, or family challenges, I was able to offer both practical advice and emotional support based on my own experience of navigating uncertainty with family assistance. The crisis that had felt isolating and overwhelming at the time had become a source of wisdom and connection that enriched my relationships and community involvement. The studio apartment eventually became a stepping stone to home ownership when I'd saved enough for a down payment and established sufficient credit history and income stability to qualify for a mortgage. The small house I eventually purchased represented a different kind of security and independence than I'd originally imagined, but no less meaningful for being unexpected. David grew from a tiny infant into an energetic toddler who brought continuous joy and laughter to family gatherings. And watching Chloe and Tyler develop as parents reminded me of the importance of family support during major life transitions. Their success as a young family was built on the foundation of honest communication and mutual assistance that had emerged from our collective housing crisis. The eviction notice remained in my files as a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how important it is to maintain both independence and connection with people who care about your welfare. The experience had taught me to plan for uncertainty while remaining open to support when challenges exceed individual capacity to handle them alone. Denver's rental market continued evolving, becoming even more expensive and competitive as the city's population and economy grew. And young professionals arriving after me faced even greater challenges in finding affordable housing. I often shared my experience and advice with newcomers navigating similar difficulties in a market that seemed designed to exclude rather than welcome people without significant financial resources. These conversations reminded me that individual housing crises are often symptoms of larger systemic issues that require collective solutions and community support. The personal resilience and family connections that had helped me navigate my own challenges were important, but insufficient to address the broader affordability crisis affecting entire generations of young adults. The experience ultimately taught me that true security comes not from avoiding all difficulties, but from developing the skills, relationships, and resources necessary to navigate challenges successfully when they arise. The apartment may have been lost, but the growth, connections, and wisdom that emerged from that loss proved more valuable and durable than any specific living situation could have been. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.